Our last talk for today, last but not least, is Ellie from Espresso Systems, and she will talk about threshold encryption to prevent MEV, right?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So thank you, Ellie. Yeah, it should work now.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Hi. I'm Ellie. I am the lead researcher, and I'm also an engineer at Espresso Systems. And today I'm going to talk about encryption-based front-running protection in the Espresso sequencing platform. All right, so let's go. So I quickly just want to mention that this is work that we've been doing jointly with Shutter. So we actually have a blog post on this. But yeah, so this is a joint piece of work. Okay, so we have a problem, which is front-running. And the problem with front-running is basically that builders and whatever searchers, they can see the user's transaction data, and they use this against the user. You know, you front-run, you sandwich, et cetera. So you have a possible solution, which is, OK, let's encrypt our transactions. That will prevent the exposure of this information and prevent us from being front-run. And then also, maybe this provides some censorship resistance, which is another property that we want. So I'm going to talk about how we can build this today, but it's also, I'm going to highlight that this is a possible solution. I think it's a solution that a lot of people are like, yeah, it's great, let's use an encrypted mempool. But there are some drawbacks and some big open questions that we need to answer. So I'll kind of talk about those as well. All right, yeah, so encrypted mempools are great, but how are they actually going to work? So here's the basic process of what we're going to do to have an encrypted transaction, sequence it, and then decrypt it afterwards. So first, we're going to have a secret key that's generated. It's going to be split into some number of n shares, such that we can recover it with k shares. The transaction is going to be encrypted. We are then going to sequence and finalize the encrypted transaction. At this point, after the transaction is finalized, it can no longer change. Then we'll gather our k key shares and decrypt the transaction. So it's a pretty simple process. But I'd say these two parts right here are the most difficult parts because they require some sort of coordination. And this is where we can use the really good, we can use the coordination layer of the consensus protocol that we're already using to sequence transactions. We can use that coordination to do the coordination of sharing keys. Yeah, so the key idea is let's use the sequencer's consensus protocol to coordinate sharing our threshold keys, and therefore we can reuse a lot of the logic, and we can reduce the latency of decrypting the transactions at the end. All right, so now I'm just going to go through like the general process of how this is going to work. So, oh, whoops, skipped. OK, so first we're going to generate the secret key, n shares, like I talked about. And then we're going to encrypt the transaction. We have multiple transactions here. We are going to have it sequenced by the network. This is going to be finalized, and you'll notice here it's like in a different order. And then finally, we'll gather our k key shares, and then we have our decrypted transactions that can then be executed on any sort of VM or rollup, et cetera. So a nice thing about this is, if you'll notice, is that by the time we decrypt these transactions down here, that's when they get executed. So we can do this whole encrypted pipeline for any rollup, for any VM, et cetera, because all of this happens before it actually gets pushed to the rollup. And then one thing you'll notice here are that these two steps here are really similar in the protocol. So actually, what we can do is pipeline it. This is actually similar to what was in the talk about Mr. Steady. So you can pipeline this. So instead of having two separate rounds where you have to say, OK, I'm sequencing the transactions, and then I have to go through consensus to get all of the keys. You can pipeline it, and you can overlay it. So basically, in this first round up here, when you're sequencing transactions 4, 5, and 6, you're actually decrypting transactions 1, 2, and 3. And in this way, you cut your latency in half. And this is a really common distributed systems trick, is you pipeline things. So the big part here is that we reuse the sequencer logic to do the coordination among parties. And this kind of seems like a really obvious thing, right? Like obviously the consensus protocol is doing some sort of coordination, so why wouldn't you reuse it? But I would actually say it's not something that's actually used in practice a lot. Some of the current protocols are usually built on, they use a consensus protocol to sequence, and then they have a completely separate protocol that they're using to do this coordination of sharing keys. So with this, we can get really good latency. Okay, so let's go back to our process and talk about it. So I went through this whole process. You may have noticed I was very generic. I was very generic over what this secret key is and how it's split and how we recombine these key shares. And so this is what I want to talk about. So, all right, we have this secret key and we have n key shares. And so I think we have a couple of options that we can do. And I'll preface this with I'm actually not a cryptographer. Mostly I work on consensus, but hopefully I can relay the important information. So how can we split this key? So we want to split the key because we want to, we want to make it difficult for people to recover the decryption key before it's finalized, because if people can decrypt our transaction, they can front run us. So we have one option. We can do something like Shamir secret sharing. And maybe this is a possible way that could look. So the user generates a secret key, and you break it into n shares. The user encrypts each share with the validator's public keys, and then they submit it to consensus. Because each share is encrypted with the validator's public keys, only the validator will be able to decrypt them. So this is a possibility. We can also use threshold encryption, which is a different possibility. We can run some sort of DKG protocol every epoch, where an epoch is sufficiently long enough. We can publish the threshold key somewhere. The user uses the public key to encrypt their transactions, and then after the transactions are finalized, you run the threshold decryption protocol, again, using the sequencing protocol already in place. And just to note that these two options and also more options are discussed in these papers that I've linked below. So a quick note, there's actually a lot more advanced things you can do here. You could use something like AvidM, you could use maybe a more complex threshold encryption scheme. But the point is that these two options kind of capture, I think, the questions and the open research that we still need to do about using an encrypted mempool. So let's look at some of the trade-offs of doing this. So if you do like a naive Shamir secret sharing, you can't reuse the key. So once you combine all of the keys, your key is public. You can't reuse it to encrypt something else. So that means that every transaction or every single block, you need to regenerate something new, and that kind of has overhead. You need to ensure that any subset k out of n can recover the secret. So if you're using a Byzantine fault tolerant consensus mechanism, the assumption is that you have less than or roughly 1/3 or less of malicious parties. Well, something you need to make sure is that any subset of honest parties can recover the key, not just one particular subset. So this is where you might use verifiable secret sharing over just plain Shamir secret sharing. Second of all, it's potentially wasteful. So if you'll notice in option 1, if a user is sending a really small transaction that's only a couple of kilobytes, they need to also send all of these encrypted shares around, and that's really wasteful, and it's going to cost the user extra data fees in the network, which isn't great. In this design, it's also just a bunch of extra effort on the user's part. Maybe we have some sort of trusted third party that does it for the user, but that's not really good either. So here's some of the problems with option 1. But okay, let's look for option 2. It's probably impractical to run a DKG protocol for each transaction or block, especially if we're trying to scale to thousands of nodes. So this means that we need to reuse the key. But with threshold encryption, that should be fine because you're not actually revealing the private key. But this leads to the biggest question of all, which is, what about collusion? So I think that encrypted mempools are really, really great, but they have this big open question about what about collusion. So a lot of for example, the threshold encryption schemes are, they can tolerate maybe up to 1/4, malicious parties maybe up to 1/3. But the problem is that what if people are incentivized to collude? And this opens the question, what do we think actually constitutes an honest party? Because if you consider it, you could say, well, an honest party will not collude. But if an honest party does collude, they can decrypt this transaction. They can extract a bunch of MEV from it. MEV tends to be pretty spiky, but there have been cases where MEV is quite a lot. And so it very well might be worth it for otherwise honest validators to participate in this collusion. So this is kind of a really big open question. How do we handle this? Well, there's a few thoughts. So one, you might say, well, of course, why don't we use threshold encryption? One reason maybe to use a more naive solution, such as secret sharing, would be you're regenerating the key all the time. If you have really fast consensus, if you're coming to consensus within 1 second, well, maybe that's fast enough that realistically it's too fast for people to collude. Whether or not that's an accurate assumption to make is open for debate, but maybe that's an argument you might make. With threshold encryption, though, since you're only regenerating the key every epoch, and supposedly the epoch is going to be sufficiently long, you actually have plenty of time for parties to collude. So for example, let's say you start an epoch, you generate your new threshold key. That threshold key is good for the next 32 blocks, let's say. Well, someone who submits a transaction, really early on, the network can wait to sequence it and first collude all of their keys, decrypt it, and then build a block that front runs them. Okay, so I think that this is the big open question of this talk, is like, how do we handle this? There are definitely more complex cryptographic protocols that we can use, although I think none of the ones that I have seen have really completely solved this. So we want something that's collusion resistant, which I think goes beyond just the cryptographic protocol. We need to think about, incentives. So any protocol that's going to have any sort of honest majority assumption is not going to be collusion resistant if we are under the assumption that parties will act rationally rather than honestly. We also don't want something that relies on users being online. So a naive solution might be, well, okay, the user encrypts their transaction, and then after it's sequenced, the user just sends everybody the decrypt key. But that's not very good for relying that users are online. Maybe this could work if the user has some sort of trusted third party that does this for them, but then again, we're introducing this trusted third party that we ideally don't want to involve. So what to do? To be really honest, I don't have an answer for this. I think that this is an open question, and I would really like to hear people's thoughts, because I think encrypted mempools are great, but I think that this is like the one really big question that people are not talking about, is collusion. So that's the main part of the talk. But I just want to run through some other quick considerations about encrypted mempools that I think that we should think about. So, okay, we have this problem with front running, and we think that we can use encrypted mempools to solve it. But what about spam? So MEV is very profitable, specifically the top of the block, so how you do like arbitrage, etc. If you do encrypted transactions and you require that all transactions are encrypted, well, maybe you just get a bunch of people spamming because they're hoping to be that first transaction in the block. So that's really not good for the network. It could also cause network congestion. You have spam, it's going to cause network congestion because you have a bunch of stuff that's not actually valuable. That's also not good. Well, I would say that unlike the collusion issue, I think we actually have some solutions to this. So spam can be handled with an appropriate fee mechanism, but I think it can be handled by plain text top of block auctions. So if you're not really familiar with the MEV space, the top of the block is the most valuable because that's where you can do most of your MEV. So just allow those transactions to be plain text. They don't need to be encrypted because they're going to be executed first. And the whole point of those transactions is that they are front-running other transactions. So just let those transactions be in a separate part of the block, and the encrypted transactions can be elsewhere. Second of all, you can use a sequencing platform that's designed for really, really high throughput. So this would be an example of where you'd want to use maybe an external consensus mechanism, such as like a DAG like we saw earlier, or Espresso that has really high throughput, so we can handle any sort of spam that comes in the network. Okay, well then you have another thing here where it's like, well, the encryption adds extra latency to the protocol. Naively, this encryption is going to add 2 times, or it's going to double the latency of the protocol because you have the time it takes to sequence, and then you have to go through consensus again to actually decrypt it, and that's not ideal. And to that, I'd say, well, yes, you can't avoid that. Obviously, you're adding an extra round to decrypt something. You can't avoid that that's going to have extra latency, and that's just like a trade-off that you make when you choose to submit an encrypted transaction. But the good thing is that if you do this in the way that I described, it doesn't add any extra latency for plain text transactions. And not all transactions need to be encrypted. If I am just doing a simple swap with like someone I know, I don't need to encrypt that because that cannot be front run. So in this case, you're only adding extra latency to transactions that actively choose encryption and not other transactions. And then finally, you could say, well, encrypted transactions have to pay high fees. Why do they have to pay high fees? Because you can't extract MEV from them. So you say, well, if a builder is coming, have an encrypted transaction that they can't get money off of, they're just going to charge more to include it. And I think we can actually deal with this by just not having congestion in the network. So if we have a network that can handle all of the traffic that we need, and you don't have congestion, builders will include any transaction they can. The more transactions they include, the more fees that they get. So they actually will not charge extra for encrypted transactions so long as the network is not congested. Okay, so this is a fairly short talk, but I just want to give a couple of takeaways, are that encrypted transactions can prevent front-running and improve censorship resistance. These are really, really good properties. We can reuse consensus and sequencer logic to coordinate key sharing and decryption. We can pipeline it for even better throughput, and this is really great. This makes this whole system really robust, and we have good latency, et cetera. But we have the huge question of what do we do about colluding parties? So I'd say there's two parts to this question. The one is, do we actually consider this a problem? I have seen some people argue that yes, people could collude, but that's not part of being an honest validator, so we don't have to worry about it. Or is this something that we should actually worry about? If we do need to worry about it, we have to really think hard about how we're doing this threshold encryption cryptography. And then finally, encrypted transactions have different economic incentives than plain text transactions, and that's actually totally fine, because we can design protocols that allow both of them to coexist and for encrypted transactions and plain text transactions to not actually affect each other. And we can do that through using a top-of-block auction, designs, like I said, et cetera. So really quick talk. I would really love it if anybody had any opinions on how to solve this collusion thing, or if you have any opinions on if that's not a problem at all. I'd be really interested in that. All right, so thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Ellie. Anyone wants to chime in?
What's a verifiable Shamir secret sharing, and how does it help?
Yeah, so a verifiable, it's basically it allows you to verify that the share that you get actually commits to something. So you can say, oh, I know that this actually commits to this transaction, and therefore it allows you to kind of get any party will be able to or any K parties will be able to reconstruct it. I'm definitely not an expert in that, so I'm sure other people who are more an expert could give a better explanation, but that's the general difference. It's kind of like an extension on top of like regular Shamir secret sharing.
Yeah, no doubt. I wanted to ask actually about the fees. So you say in order to prevent spam, you can get more fees for encrypted transactions, but transactions are encrypted, and until you decrypt them, you don't know if they're spam or not. They could be invalid signatures. So how do you do that? Do you add like a plain text fee field, or how do you do it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, yeah, I agree. The network doesn't know what is spam and what isn't. I'd say it's more just having a fee mechanism that, like, if someone is going to spam, like if having an appropriate fee mechanism that charges for like the data you're submitting. So if I'm submitting a megabyte worth of spam transactions, I should definitely be paying more than someone submitting just 1 kilobyte transaction. That's just what I mean. I actually think that the better option is the top-of-block auction. Yeah.
Yeah, because I could essentially just transmit all the transactions in the block to be encrypted random values that have no meaning.
Yeah.
And then you don't know it until it's too late, right? So
that's true. So yeah, and that's a reason where it's important to have a good fee mechanism, because obviously the network is still doing work. Even if you submit junk that's encrypted, the network has to still do the work to decrypt it. So yeah, you need to have an appropriate fee mechanism that's compensating people for potentially decrypting things that end up turning out to be invalid transactions. But also back to the fee question you were saying, yes. So I actually think transactions would need to contain some sort of fee outside. It needs to be tied to the so I think you have two different fees. You have a gas fee that's actually tied into the transaction, and then you would have a sequencing fee, could also be known as like a data availability fee, and that fee is separate, and you would pay that, that would be paid no matter whether your transaction executes or not. So that would probably, it is, I guess it wouldn't have to be, but likely it would be, yes.
Okay. No, if it's playtext, then
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So have you thought about using like time lock puzzle to solve something like this?
Yeah, so that's a good idea. We have briefly discussed this, and this is probably where I'm going a little bit out of my depth. I think the issue, it depends on the time lock puzzle. Like, were you thinking of using like a VDF kind of?
Yeah, something that you encrypt like the transactions like for a while,
Mhm.
and then you can even do like a patching like the
Yeah, so I think this is, and maybe you can let me know more. I think the difficulty is with consensus, you don't have a guarantee of when your transaction is going to be committed. So in the optimistic case, you may know that it's going to be committed within 2 seconds, but it may not be committed for 30 seconds if you're having like network asynchrony. And in that sense, then the decryption key would be, you know, revealed early. Or maybe if you have a time lock puzzle, I think it's doable. But if you have a time lock puzzle, when do you start the time lock? Because you don't want to start it when you make the transaction, because then I, as a builder, can just sit on it and wait for it to time out. So you would need to start it once it's like, I don't know, realistically committed by the network already, because that's the only time you know that once it's committed, you can't front on it. So I think it could work. Maybe I should think about it more. If you have more ideas, I'd be interested. Yeah.
Is there any economic analysis that you've done on the TOP, the top of the block? Is it very relevant that will solve the problem? Or is it just a naive way that's saying that everybody has to go to the top of the block to get a signature execution?
Yeah, so this isn't work that like Espresso has done, but there has been some work by like Flashbots, where they do a lot of analysis of top of block. It's more of an empirical evidence right now, where this is what they see when with builders and Flashbots, is that the most valuable stuff is the top of block. That's just kind of empirically what's
That's
the
on
case.
Ethereum, right? That's not on the rolls.
It is true it's on Ethereum. I guess on the rollups today just have centralized sequencers, so we don't have any data. Like rollups today have centralized sequencers, so they just do first come, first serve ordering. But once rollups start to decentralize their sequencers, we'll probably see a very similar paradigm, is the thought.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Ellie.
Thank you.
So, thank you everyone for staying with us so long. This concludes the first edition of Encrypt, which we're very excited to have had. We are planning to have many more. And so please stay tuned, and thank you for all our speakers, all our co-hosts and sponsors. And it was a real pleasure to have you all here today. So thank you very much.